Good morning and welcome to Coach's Corner number 4 now. I'm here with Paul Moffatt, the owner of Velosophy.ca and coach to the Meraloma Bike Club. And I am Alex Spraggs, the race director of the Meraloma Bike Club. And we're here to discuss some more questions that came from Meraloma members this week about training and riding in this season. So one of the things is that we didn't quite finish off what we were discussing last week with our nutrition section, in that we discussed what to eat before and during a ride, but we didn't get to what we should eat after a ride. So let's finish off that conversation and discuss how to properly fuel yourself after a ride to ensure good recovery, and we'll go from there. So yeah, Paul. Well, first of all, how are you doing? And then let's get into the question.
I'm doing great. Thanks, Alex. Been a good week. So lots of time on the bike as usual. So yeah, doing good. Ready to talk some more bikes. So for post-ride nutrition, again, we always want to think timing and then the breakdown of the food, how much protein, how much carbohydrates, et cetera, et cetera. So in terms of timing, we know that there's an ideal window where you get a kind of a bump in your results if you can eat within approximately the first hour of your exercise. There is some research to say that the first 30 or 40 minutes is better, the first 60. Generally speaking, if you're going to eat within 60 minutes of finishing your ride, you capitalize on where your body is at in terms of its metabolic process. So it's much easier for your body to turn catabolic processes into anabolic processes. In other words, breaking down into building up processes if you hit it in the first hour window. Now, having said that, if you don't get that first hour in, don't think that it's all over. The most important thing to do is replace all those calories, right? Even if your goal isn't weight loss, you want to start teaching your body how to turn carbohydrates into muscle glycogen and not into adipose fat, right? So eating after a ride is just plain and simply a smart thing to do because it'll just improve your results, right? The first hour, we know we're going to have a little bit better benefits from doing that. So that's always a good thing to do. And post-ride, we want to focus a little more on proteins than carbohydrates, right? Carbohydrates are still going to be very important at this point, because we want to refill muscle glycogen, and exposing your body to a decent amount to it will hopefully supersede the amount of muscle glycogen it usually stores. Now, in terms of like exactly how much, obviously it's going to be relative to the rider. A bigger rider is going to need more protein, more carbohydrates, et cetera. A smaller rider, maybe a little bit less. Generally speaking, in terms of protein demands, without getting too complicated, you need just more than about 8 grams of protein to start a proper anabolic process. So, that's pretty easy for most people to get. It could be you start with a protein shake and then you have a pre-prepared rice dish or something like that, or it's just a big meal. So for myself, I usually batch cook my meals. So whatever I made for dinner the night before usually has a nice lean protein in it. So it might be a grilled chicken or something like that, and then some wild rice and some mixed vegetables. I'll have that ready to go for the next day. So when I finish my ride, I can just heat that up and it's ready to go. So then I know I'm getting a good source of lean protein in there, and I've got good sources of carbohydrates in there, including complex carbohydrates from vegetables. But you don't have to overcomplicate it, right? So good protein, decent amount, good carbohydrates, decent amount. So you just need a little bit more protein than you have maybe for the pre-ride meal. Carbohydrates is probably going to be about the same. So yeah, just keep that one simple.
So what do you think about hitting up Red Truck for a burger and a beer right after your long ride?
Okay, that's a good question. So I'll play both sides of the coin here. Because your metabolism is raised if you're going to have a cheat meal or a cheeky meal that you know is probably not that healthy, it's probably the best time in the day to have it, right? Because your metabolism is high, your body will sort through that food and extract what it can use, right? And it will probably use up more of the carbohydrates from the bun as muscle glycogen, things like that, and process the meat differently. Whereas if you had it later on when your feet are up on the couch and your ride was 6 hours ago, you're more likely to store that up as adipose tissue. So yeah, if you're going to have a cheeky meal, it's probably better to do it just after your ride, in spite of the fact that it's kind of counterintuitive, right? Most people I find try to eat really healthy after a ride, and the rest of the day is just crap food. If you switch that around, again, playing devil's advocate here, you probably have better results from that. So from personal experience, I'm a big fan of sweet things. I like brownies and cookies and things like that. So post ride, that's my treat. That's my reward for going on a big ride. I'll have a brownie and a coffee, but I also complement that with a good meal. So I kind of find a nice balance point, right, between the two, where I'm having something that's a real treat, but I also doing something that I know is going to help me in the long run. Now, alcohol or beer, and this is the trouble for stopping right after the ride. Alcohol is a big inflammator, really, really big. And it's probably, for most people, the biggest reason why you're not seeing your goals is a little bit too much alcohol intake. And if you're doing that right after a ride, you can really stifle your progress. So in terms of alcohol consumption, I tend personally to wait as late as I can to have that. So if I'm having a midday ride, I won't have a drink till much later in the day. So that 1 hour window is probably where the one time where you don't want to have your alcohol consumption. So that's just some guidelines that I use. Having said that, like a lot of people, that's why they ride, socialize with their friends. But maybe you grab a light beer instead of the 6% craft beer at your local brewery, right? So maybe a Radler or something like that instead. In fact, in Europe, ironically, they do a lot of isotonic beers. So they're basically 0% alcohol or 1%, but it's pretty popular after a race to have an isotonic beer. And it's actually quite hydrating because it's isotonic, which is, it's kind of like what you have when you put a Noon or a Scratch Labs thing in your drink mix. It's the same concentration as your blood fluid levels. So your body will absorb that really quickly. So if you really just like the taste of beer, maybe that's your hack.
I like it. That's a good hack. So great. Thank you so much. I mean, that's really helpful. I know that a lot of us are concerned about, what we should be doing after a ride and how we should be fueling and doing what's best to make sure that we recover for the next ride, and so that we can get out there and do our best.
Yeah.
Next day. Another kind of in terms of riders who are newer to cycling and are just getting into these longer rides, these weekend rides that we're posting, where we're going out to White Cliff or out to Deep Cove or around Richmond, and you're on the bike for 3 or 4 hours. How should we be pacing those rides? So, I'm going out to White Cliff, I'm going around Stanley Park, and I hit the Prospect Point hill climb. Do I smash it up that climb, or how should I be thinking about pacing throughout the ride?
Right. So I like to think of my energy for the day as like a bucket, right? Bucket full of energy. And if you think about the term that we've been throwing around a lot lately is FTP, or like this kind of threshold level, right? So where you're climbing is at a pretty decent capacity. So efforts that are at FTP or above FTP take a big scoop out of the bucket, maybe a little bit more than is needed, right? So it leaves your bucket a little bit depleted afterwards. Now, on big steep climbs, there's not a whole lot you can do about that. Sometimes you're maybe in your last gear, and it's hard to pace it because just keeping going requires you to go to FTP or above, right? But where you can, I would try to buffer that. So if there's no need to crush Prospect Point and there's still 3 hours of riding left, I would sit underneath my FTP. It doesn't mean that you're necessarily going that slowly, but just a little lower. So maybe 80–90% of your FTP. And that's more like skimming the top of your bucket rather than taking a big scoop out of it, right? You should always think about like how you want to feel at the end of your ride. Even when you get fitter, it doesn't mean that you can smash every single hill climb, right? So you got to think, if I want to feel good at the end of the ride, maybe finish a little bit faster towards the end, I got to be a little bit conservative at the start to make sure that I got enough energy in my bucket to get to that point. So I use like a sag climbing rule. So I go softer up the climbs, but it doesn't mean you're necessarily slower, especially if you're using the descent to build up speed. So what I find most novice riders do is they expend all their energy up a hill and they coast down the other side, and then they lose all their momentum when they're on the flats. So between the downhill and the flat, they've lost a lot of the time that they've gained by smashing the hill. Whereas you dial it back a little bit and you just sit under a threshold, when you get to the top of the climb, you don't feel too gassed. So you don't necessarily need all that recovery. You don't need to coast on the other side. You can spin up and use the descent to your advantage. And when you hit the bottom of the hill, because you have more momentum, because you haven't been coasting, you're faster on the flats too. So you've made up any difference that you would have normally had if you were just smashing the one side and coasting the other. So it's almost the same amount of time, but the big benefit between that and the other way is that it's much less fatigue. So you can do that repeatedly throughout the ride. So that's one of the techniques that I use to do my long riding. And if you're doing it well, you'll probably find in the 3rd or 4th hour that you feel almost as good as your 1st or 2nd hour. That's usually the ultimate key to knowing that your pacing strategy is working really well. Yeah.
Yeah, and one thing that I find is I particularly, I know that I did this a lot when I first started riding, is that, I would really hit the gas going up a hill.
Yeah.
And then I would run out of steam right as you get to the crest, and that's when you're like, oh, I can just like let up. And then you lose all your speed on that, like that very slight gradient right at the crest of the hill.
Yeah.
And then so you start coming down the other side and you're barely even moving. Whereas, that crest of the hill, and particularly, when you get more advanced and you start racing, that crest of the hill is oftentimes the decider. It's like the critical moment is whether or not you have the power to power over the crest and build and keep any, replace any momentum you lost up the hill and build momentum going in the downhill. Yeah. That crest is like a really critical moment, and if you really gas it going up the hill, your motivation to continue to press hard over the crest will quickly disappear.
Yeah, I got a great anecdote about just that same thing. So I was out on a training ride one day out to Britannia Beach, and I bumped into an old teammate of mine, and he was a pretty advanced racer, and at the time I thought I was like hot shit. But he basically schooled me. He used all of his experience to really put me in the hurt locker. So coming back from Britannia Beach, he's like, all right, we're going to pace this one like a race. So we set our limits for climbing and flat riding if either of us was on the front. Now, he had no trouble keeping up with me on the climbs and coming over the top. We're pretty evenly matched in terms of like power output. But he used to do this one little thing that just destroyed me that day. And it's exactly what you're talking about. I realized that I was still riding like an amateur at that point. So just like you're talking about the crest of the hill, I would just get to the top and I start to slow down and I'd coast some of it, and then eventually I'd pedal through it, right? So I was going just a little too hard and then requiring recovery as I crested. Whereas he would pace it just a little bit slower, not much, but just a little bit. But as he got to the crest, he would actually shift into the next gears because he knew he was going to need them on the downhill. And he would just put a couple strong pedal strokes over the top. And because I was still using my strategy, he would put in about 3 to 4 bike lengths on me, just instantaneously. Boom. We'd get to the bottom of the hill, and I'd have to pull that back. But by the time I'm at the bottom of the hill, that 4 bike lengths was now 6 or 7. So it was this big effort just to get back in his draft. Now you multiply that by how many of those little crests and hills are along the sea to sky, and I was basically trying to play catch up to him for a good like 30 or 40 minutes. And he's going at like 40, 45 kilometers an hour. So pulling that back is a big effort. I was cross-eyed by the time we got back to Vancouver, and he looked fresh as a daisy. So I knew, and he calls it humping the bump or something to that effect, where you just like cruise over the crest with just a little bit of momentum, and then he takes every bit of that momentum down the downhill. He kind of drilled it into me that if you're coasting, you're slowing down. And you don't necessarily need to be working hard to go down a hill, but if you can at least move your legs, you can recover at the same time as you're building up momentum. And that can be a really useful tool for riders to learn as they're coming up.
Excellent, thank you. So this is, I think this is relevant to a lot of riders at the Meraloma Club, those who are more time pressed and don't have 10, 12 hours a week to put on their bike or more. And so they're looking at, they have 4 hours a week. They have maybe one weekday ride, their Wednesday ride, with the Meraloma Club, and one weekend ride, 3-hour ride out to wherever. Other than that, their schedules, they have kids, they have jobs, whatever, it keeps them pretty time restricted. If that is the type of schedule that you're looking at, how, we emphasize a lot of kind of zone 1 work, where you do these long kind of aerobic efforts to build heart and lungs more than legs. But if you've only got 4 hours, does it make sense to be spending a lot of time in zone 1?
Yeah, I mean, that's the theory makes a lot of sense. However, you still get benefits from training in zone 1, even if you have a small amount of time to use, right? And the best example I can give you is if you're too busy to get out for a proper ride, or you're too tired or fatigued, a zone 1 ride will still improve your fitness, right? It's still a ride. There's evidence to show that even if you have a short amount of time to train during the week, doing zone one rides are pretty beneficial. However, again, it's always dependent on the rider. You have to really take someone's goals into account and how quick their events are coming up. So if you had 20 weeks away from your goal event, I would probably phase my training out. So I do maybe like 6 weeks of just zone 1 work, where you're just picking out low-hanging fruit, especially on the weekend. So let's say you go for that 3-hour ride, right? I would start off the first few rides just doing some flat riding and just conditioning my body to a few things that I expect to see on my event. So number one, the one thing that a lot of riders do when they first start their training and they're doing their long rides, they take lots of breaks. They stop for water, they're taking selfies, they're coasting a lot, they're just not paying attention, right? They're just used to that type of riding. But on event day, the gun goes and you ride from A to B, and it's probably the first time those riders have tried not to take a break. And that in and of itself, irrespective of fitness, can be the undoing of many riders. Because if you've conditioned your body to take a break every 30, 40 minutes to take a photo or take a pee break or something like that, and then you try to go beyond that in a race, that can be your undoing, right? Same with just plain old pedaling. So have you ever done a 3-hour ride and tried to pedal the whole time, right? With the exception of like a steep downhill or a tight corner or an intersection. But without those parameters, can you just pedal your bike that whole time? Can you do Iona and back, pedaling, no stopping? Can you do River Road, back and forth, pedaling, no stopping? And maybe do laps to that. Right? If you can accumulate that in 3-4 hour time and you haven't unclipped once, you've pedaled the whole time, you'll find that even if you do that really easily, it can be exceptionally fatiguing because you're just not used to moving your legs nonstop for 3 or 4 hours. It's a conditioning component, not necessarily like a pure aerobic fitness component. And that's something, it's a low-hanging fruit. So if you can take away those unnecessary breaks, you can get your body used to moving its feet for 3 or 4 hours. And then there's also a strength component. So when you're on the bike for 4 hours, you need a certain amount of upper body strength and core strength to hold you in that position. Plus, your butt's just got to get used to being in the seat for that long. So that's where I start my training off and just get used to that. So even if it's 3 weeks of doing those long rides outside at zone 1 and just picking off the low-hanging fruit, pedal conditioning, staying nice and good posture, essentially like good core activation, and not taking unnecessary breaks, that can be very, very valuable for your training carrying forward. Because once you start to do higher intensity stuff, it's kind of too late to start working on that. And then there's also nutrition timing as well. So most riders have a hard time eating and drinking while they ride. And if they go straight to high intensity, it's too much of a distraction. So I'll use those easy rides just to build the habit of like drinking every 10 minutes, eating every 20, just like we talked about last week, and trying to hit all my nutrition targets. So basically trying to eat everything that I bring with me and drink everything that I bring with me. And if you turn that into a habit early on, then you can move into the higher training phase, the higher intensity training phase, sorry. But yeah, so I guess there's value to both. If you're closer to your event and it's quite a demanding event, you don't have much time to train for it, then yes, it might be more valuable to you to train at a higher intensity, especially that 1 hour weekday ride. To go out and do some higher intensity stuff at threshold or just above threshold. But then on the weekend, maybe you make a bit of a compromise. So if you're going for a 3 hour ride, maybe you spend an hour and a half of it at that zone 1, practicing your low hanging fruit components, and then add in some intervals towards the end. Right, so you're basically knocking both off. And I would definitely do the lower intensity stuff before the intervals. It tends to have a better effect rather than afterwards. Basically, when your anaerobic or your high intensity engine turns on and it really switches on, everything after that, it basically shuts down your aerobic engine afterwards. So the value to your two systems starts to diminish if you're doing extra volume after doing intervals. So hopefully that answers your question a little bit.
Yeah, no, I think that's great advice. And I found personally that zone work, I found zone 1 work, I found really, really helpful on the bike. Even, I started doing zone 1 work a lot in October and November, and I found that surprisingly, and you wouldn't think that this would happen, but it really, really helped my track cycling, which is not in terms of, it isn't still an endurance sport, but in terms of the cycling racing world, track cycling is the most compressed, the shortest kind of events. But I immediately started feeling real benefits to my track cycling and just being able to repeat hard efforts and recover in the medium and lower efforts periods during a race. I think adding zone 1 work was a component I wasn't really working on before then, and I was feeling pretty immediate benefits. So, yeah.
Zone 1 work helps, like you were saying, it helps your body to recover faster after big efforts, because you're basically lifting the amount of effort you can put out as you're recovering. So there's a lot of value to doing that. So, if you're doing the Whistler Fondo, after you do Taylor Way, after you do Britannia Beach, after you do Furry Creek, there's a lot of flat riding to do. And if you're trying to keep up with a group that's maybe going faster than your aerobic capacity is able to, you're not recovering between those climbs. You're digging into the same resources that you need for your FTP, which is like what you were mentioning about track. So if you can lift that aerobic capacity when you're not doing hard efforts, you can still be going fast and recovering quite well. So there's definitely some value to developing that engine, especially in the off season when we have a bit more time. Most of us, you don't have a summer schedule, and we go back to indoor riding. Indoor riding has a very, very high yield for zone 1. And I guess there's something we also need to chat about is what is zone 1, because everybody has a different understanding of it. Right, so the zone 1 that you and I typically talk about is literally a lab test where we put you through a ramp protocol, and at the same time as we're increasing the intensity every 3 minutes or so, You either have an oxygen saturation machine on your muscles measuring when the oxygen absorption rate rapidly changes, or you get a blood lactate test, or both. And the blood lactate test will measure when your body starts to accumulate lactate. So your body's always making lactate, but it's often able to buffer it. So we know when you're working aerobically, your body is buffering it at the same rate as it's producing it. But when you start to bring your effort up above a certain point, your body can no longer buffer it. So that's when fatigue is going to start setting in, right? So we use a heart rate monitor to do that one, and that establishes like your physiological signature. So for me, it's 145 beats per minute. That number will never really change. In fact, it'll probably get lower as I age. But the power that I produce at that number will change with my training. So as long as I keep my effort under 145, I'm always in my zone 1, right? It's unlike doing, say, an FTP test, where your zone 1 is a prediction of that higher end number. So it's not super accurate. So you can make some fairly decent predictions of what it is, but there is always a degree of individual difference. Not everyone's going to have access to lab to do that. If you can, it's a valuable investment, because unlike an FTP test, which you need to do like every 6 to 12 weeks to get to keep seeing how it's improving, your zone 1 result is probably going to last you a season or 2 or 3. Like that heart rate number is not going to change very much. So it's definitely a good investment to make. If you don't have that, you can make some general guidelines. I usually use a number of approximately 135 beats per minute, and get most of my riders who haven't done a lactate zone 1 test to just use that as their starting point, and then see how it feels. If you go for a zone 1 ride and you were sitting between 130, 135 beats per minute, and it felt really intense in the second hour, well, your zone 1 is probably a lot lower than that. So you probably scale down. And in terms of zone 1, you can always hedge down. Unlike FTP, where you're always trying to push up to or above that number to change it, zone 1 is unique. You always want to stay underneath it to change it. It's very unusual. It's such a weird thing. Anyway, but let's leave it there before it gets too confusing. I'm sure we're going to open up a whole new line of questioning there. Yeah.
Oh, that's super helpful. Yeah, my aerobic capacity heart rate number is 135, and yeah, it's really interesting. It's an interesting feeling. It's like it doesn't seem that hard, but you can go surprisingly fast on flats, staying in that number. In fact, I think that's one of the things that you kind of learn, when you ride a lot, and this kind of goes back to our pacing thing, is that when I first started riding, it was just my heart rate was going up and down and up and down and up and down.
Yeah.
But if you keep it steady and you keep out like a steady power, even if it's not a lot, you'll find that you cover a lot of ground, particularly, the Richmond loop. The Richmond loop I can do in zone 1, and I can do 100 kilometers in, I think it's a little under 4 hours. So that's like, 26 kilometers an hour, 25 kilometers an hour, something like that.
That's by yourself, right? So
Yeah.
if you had a couple guys there, that's 26 would become 30, 35 kilometers an hour at a pseudo recovery pace where you could keep going. I'm sure you've experienced that on a zone 1 ride. You get to the end, and you're like, I could knock out another 2 hours and add another 50, 60K to this ride if I wanted to. And that's the indication that your zone 1 training is working. So the trouble to zone 1 is it takes time to develop, right? And we're talking about, if we compare that to FTP is kind of like the power that you put out for 40 to 60 minutes, okay? So after you've done your FTP test, you go out to Seymour and you test out that number and see how long you can hold it for. You're probably going to have a hard time holding it all the way to the end. So it's only like 40 to 60 minutes worth of power. Aerobic capacity is like 3 to 5 hours worth of power. So where do you want to invest your time? Do you want to add an extra 10 watts to 60 minutes of power? Or do you want to add an extra 10 watts to 3 to 5 hours of riding time? Because on your fondos, 10 watts across 3 to 5 hours is going to make 10, 20 minutes worth of difference to some riders. Whereas an extra 10 watts in your FTP might only be a minute or two on your best cypress time. So yeah, the downside is it takes quite a while for it to develop. Zone 1 training requires, instead of intensity, volume to really start working well and to start working quickly. But it's going to take 8 to 12 weeks before you see significant changes. And that's if you have the time to train in Zone 1. So that's where, I guess, coming back to our first point, the question that you had, if you're getting close to event time, maybe you just focus on the high intensity scale. If you have a long time, take some time to develop your Zone 1 engine. So yeah.
So the last question for today, and I think this is also a question to put back to the members for feedback, see what their thoughts are. But the last question is, what kind of goals can we set? Now that all the races are canceled, and it looks like the RBC Grand Fondo is canceled, so we don't have those specific goals to keep in our mind to kind of schedule our training around and be motivated for. So what kind of goals can we think about? And then I'll put this to the Meraloma members to kind of provide us with the goals that you think we should set up. And then we can work as a club to kind of work towards them. But Paul, in your mind, what kind of things can we be looking at for goals this season?
So this is a time where Strava really shows its colors because just because your events are gone doesn't mean there's no incentive to train, right? This is where you can kind of like fuel your ego a little bit and start with maybe some simple goals. Like, what are your favorite segments on Strava? When you go for a ride and you're out to Horseshoe Bay, there's probably going to be a couple segments where you always go back to and you look at how you stack up against your buddy, right? So maybe you set that as a goal for yourself. You can be like, okay, well, there's the climb out of the marina. I know that I can do it in about 4 minutes 50, and so can do it at 4:40. So my goal is to try and knock them off the ladder. Set that goal for about 4 weeks from today, and use a structured training plan to try and do similar sorts of efforts and develop that engine, and then go back and test it and have some fun, right? So using kind of Strava to incentivize your training a little bit and to move up the Strava ladder boards. The other thing is to start doing your bucket list rides, right? So maybe there's a ride that you've always wanted to do. Maybe it's the Gibson Grind Fondo, or you've always wanted to do the Tour de Victoria. Personally, I'm a big fan of the Tour de Victoria Loop solo. As a race, it's a great race, but I've always found it just a little nerve-wracking with lots of people. But as an individual ride, it's a big day. It's very challenging, but it's an amazing course. So you can download that onto your computer, maybe take 3 or 4 of your friends, and it gives you something to still work towards. So you're basically doing a virtual event, right? So you're still doing the event that you intended to do. You're just doing it on your own terms. It'll still require training to do. It's 160 kilometers. It's good climbing. You have to go into it fit enough to do the whole day, and set yourself some small goals on the day as well. Maybe you're only going to take 2 or 3 breaks for water and for pee break, etc. You're creating kind of a race environment for yourself. Other things you can do is sign up to some of the Zwift series. So Escape Velocity is running Saturday morning races and Wednesday evening, Tuesday night. Ironically, Wednesday nights is the Tuesday night crits that they used to have. So they're having an online series of that. Yeah, ultimately, it's just finding things that motivate you. For a lot of my riders, it's as simple as trying to get their best cypress time, right? So, or Seymour or something like that. So just take the next few weeks to kind of come up with a bucket list of things that are valuable to you as a rider, things that, stoke your ego, that you're stoked to tell people about. Like, if you've done a triple crown, that's a huge milestone too. And a lot of riders probably haven't tackled that one before. So yeah, just think about things that really motivate you and use those as carrots to drag you along for your training.
Absolutely. I think that's those are some great tips. And yeah, if
Well, let's ask you, what are some of yours? Because if you share some of yours, that'll probably inspire other people to putting you on the spot here, Alex.
oh boy, yeah. Well, actually, the Triple Crown is one that I've never done. I'd really like to do that, and I've also always kind of had in mind a Triple Crown that not really many people do, but the Seymour Grouse up the gravel road up to actual Grouse Mountain, up
Right.
Mountain Highway, like the full Triple Crown, as opposed to the normal Triple Crown is just up to the Grouse Mountain parking lot.
Yeah, that's legit.
But doing the real one up the
Yeah.
gravel road on a gravel bike, so doing all three mountains on a gravel bike, I think that would be a lot of fun. So that's
There you go, right away. There's your, if you were training for that event exclusively, we'll probably have to teach you how to climb under your threshold power a little bit more and expand the duration that you could climb in. So the sweet spot drills. So far, some of the workouts we've been sending you guys have been around FTP, and probably go about 10% under that and grow the amount of time that you could do it at. So it could be like 15 minutes the first week for 4 intervals, then 20 minutes 2 weeks later, 30, 35, until you can do blocks of 40 minutes at that power 2 to 3 times. And that would simulate 2 to 3 mountains, right? If you can do 40 minutes of climbing at an almost FTP number, that's basically what you're going to be doing Seymour at. Now, on the day, it's probably going to be a lot longer, but at least you'll have that engine to fall back on, and also teach you a good pacing strategy and how long you can hold that power for. So use your training to simulate that. If you can't hold 80% of your threshold for 40 minutes during a training ride, probably not going to be able to do that for the Triple Crown. So just having goals like that will lead your training right there. So yeah.
so great. So yeah, I mean, any members, when you're listening to this, think about what goals you might have, and particularly any goals that might be shared amongst other Meraloma members. And we can provide them to Paul, and he can help make sure that the training schedule that he's providing to us can fit around those goals. If we have a group Meraloma goal, say doing the Valley Fondo, which is a great one in the Valley, doing the Valley Fondo by July 15th, for instance, then we can help make sure that our training program is kind of geared around those types of goals.
Yeah. And then one more note just about those training goals and things like that. So the downside to Strava is sometimes it can encourage the worst of people, where you overtrain, you get a little caught up with doing the monthly distance challenge and the monthly climbing challenge, and you just start to add a lot of junk miles in there. When you set out your goals, try and set them about a month apart so that you can have 4 weeks of good value structured training leading up to that point. So you're going to prepare for it, and then you're going to do it. Prepare and do. So right now I'm getting a lot of my athletes to pick one goal or one event simulation per month. So one for June, one for July, one for August, and maybe a finisher in September before the season really winds down. And so each month is something special. And then that will help incentivize us to do a block of training for each one. So yeah, just a nice measured approach.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Paul. And I look forward to chatting with you more next week at the next Coach's Corner.
And you, thanks for having me, Alex. Talk to you soon.
Take care.